Hey Warriors, this video is for U.S. history, and we're going to talk about the material found on page 47 in your U.S. history booklet, 47 and 48. So let's begin. We're first going to talk about the Vietnam War and some basic information about that war, what was going on in Vietnam in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And then we're going to talk about, because of what was going on in Vietnam, we're going to talk about a Supreme Court case that was decided by the Supreme Court in 1971, the New York Times versus the United States Supreme Court case. So first, Vietnam. Vietnam is a small country in Southeast Asia, and even though it's a small country, it was very rich in a variety of resources. For instance, rubber, tin, oil, rice, lots of natural resources in Vietnam. And so naturally, because it was a small country that was very rich in resources, it kind of historically had become the target of larger countries or more powerful countries who wanted to come in and occupy their land and to control their resources and export their resources. So they're developed in Vietnam in the 40s and 50s a stronger and stronger movement to gain their own independence and freedom. And during this time, France was controlling Vietnam, controlling the resources of Vietnam. Okay, so that's a little bit of information about Vietnam as a country and sort of what they were facing. Back to this independence movement that was going on within Vietnam. There was one person primarily who was leading this freedom and independence movement. His name was Ho Chi Minh, and he was a communist. So when we talk about communism, you remember we just a couple lessons ago talked about the Cold War, that after World War II, the Cold War began as a war of ideas, those ideas being communism and capitalism or democracy. And so when we talked about the Cold War, we talked very briefly about Korea and Vietnam being these two military conflicts that developed that drew other countries into being involved because they were supporting either the communist cause or the democratic cause. And this is what happens in Vietnam. There, in the northern part of Vietnam, there is the communist cause led by Ho Chi Minh. In the southern part of Vietnam, there is a democratic government set up controlling part of the southern part of the country under President Diem there. And so you have this civil war essentially between these two factions to try to control the destiny of Vietnam. And so behind the North Vietnamese, you had other communist countries lending economic support, military support in this effort. And behind the South Vietnamese government and people, you had democratic nations coming in behind them with economic support and military support. So this becomes the conflict that we know today as the Vietnam War. And you probably know that America was pretty significantly involved in the Vietnam War, although we never declared war against Vietnam. That is Congress's job. Congress never made a declaration of war against Vietnam. What they did, part of the way through this process, is to issue what was referred to as the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which essentially gave the president, then President Lyndon Johnson, the power to act according to whatever he thought was best, including the use of our military. And so by 1968, we had about 500,000 troops, 500,000 military troops, American troops in Vietnam, fighting a war, and we had never even declared war. So these are some of the reasons why the Vietnam War, when we just talked about countercultural movements, we talked about the anti-war movement briefly. This is some of the reason why there were a lot of people, citizens in the United States, who were strongly opposed to the Vietnam War. Okay? So all of this is kind of background for the Supreme Court case that is coming. So let's look at this story that becomes New York Times versus the United States. In 1967, there was a man named Robert McNamara. His name is on your worksheet. He was the Secretary of Defense for the U.S. government. So the Secretary of Defense is like the department head who oversees all things military in the country. So he's in charge of the United States military in its totality. And in 1967, Robert McNamara orders that there be a report compiled or put together about the United States involvement in Vietnam up to that present day, up to 1967. And so this report begins to be put together. It ends up being 7,000 pages. 7,000 pages, a huge report. 3,000 of those pages were narrative or the story, and 4,000 pages were documents or supporting documentation. And so here's the best way I can explain the storyline and the documentation. Let's say the story of my day is that I get up in the morning and I go to the coffee shop, I get a coffee, I get a chocolate croissant, and I sit down and I eat them, and I leave and come back home. Okay, on the way home, I stop at 7-Eleven and I get some gas for my Jeep. So the story would be just that. I got up in the morning, I went to the coffee shop, I had a coffee, I had a croissant, I went to 7-Eleven, I filled up my gas tank in my Jeep, and I went home. The supporting documentation for that might be that I have a receipt from the coffee shop showing what time I was there, what I ordered, how much I paid for it. The next piece of documentation would be a receipt from 7-Eleven showing how much gas I got, how much I paid for it, what grade of gas it was, when I bought it, all those kinds of things that you can find on a receipt. So this report was a mixture of a story being told and documentation to prove that the story was true. Okay? So that report eventually became known as the Pentagon Papers. Now let's talk about the next person on your sheet. The next person is Daniel Ellsberg. And during this time, Daniel Ellsberg was working for the Defense Department. He was a security analyst and a military analyst for the Defense Department. And at some point, part of his job became helping to put together this huge 7,000-page report. While he was doing this work, he began to look at the paperwork and read the contents of this report, and he became very, very upset and disturbed by what he was reading. He recognized that the U.S. government, many presidential administrations, had been lying to the American people about our involvement in Vietnam. And when I say many presidential administrations, I'm talking about 4 or 5 different administrations at this point. We have the Truman administration. Right after FDR died in 1945, Harry Truman becomes president. Then President Eisenhower, then President Kennedy, then President Johnson after President Kennedy is shot. And now, by the time this report is compiled and this problem with the New York Times starts, Richard Nixon is president. So you have 5 different presidents involved really in this report and the conflict around this report. Daniel Ellsberg decides that he is going to go public with this information. This is called being a whistleblower, by the way. And I may make a separate video about whistleblowers and just exactly what they do and kind of what they risk when they do it. But a whistleblower essentially is someone working on the inside of an organization. They recognize something's going on that is wrong, and they decide to tell people on the outside of the organization about those wrong things that are happening. It can be really risky. Daniel Ellsberg decides that he is going to copy portions of this massive 7,000-page report and begin to deliver them to various newspapers throughout the country. The New York Times, the Washington Post, the Boston Globe, major newspapers with huge circulation, meaning that they deliver many, many, many copies of their newspaper to people all over the country. So he becomes a whistleblower. He lets the cat out of the bag. The United States government has been lying to the American people about their involvement in Vietnam for more than 20 years. The next character is Richard Nixon. As I just mentioned, he became president. He was elected in 1968. He took office in 1969. And it was 1971, his second year in office, when these reports began to be leaked to the newspapers and they began to print them. When President Nixon saw this information being reported in the New York Times, he contacted the New York Times and he said, you have to stop printing this immediately. And he tried to put an order, a prior restraint order, against them. Okay? You know, restraining order, this is a prior restraint order. It's essentially telling a person or an organization they can't do a certain kind of thing because you're afraid that if they do that, they're going to do something wrong. Okay? So he essentially puts a gag order on the New York Times as far as reporting on the Pentagon Papers and this issue. All right? The New York Times says, we're a newspaper, and in the First Amendment of the Constitution, there's something called the freedom of the press. We get information that we have verified is true, we should be able to print it. That's our constitutional right as a newspaper. So the Supreme Court gets news of this, and they don't even wait. They don't even wait for it to go through, lower courts. They snatch up this case right away, and they say, we're going to look at this and make a decision as quickly as we can. Okay? So they looked at all the evidence. They looked at what was going on. The President Nixon and his administration said, well, the problem here is that these are national security concerns. It's national security. We have to protect national security. They shouldn't be able to print these things. So, long story short, the Supreme Court comes back with their decision. The vote is 6-3 against the President and against the U.S. government. They say, 6 out of 9 of those justices said, yes, the New York Times has perfect right under the Constitution, under the First Amendment and the freedom of the press. They have a perfect right to print that material, and they should be allowed to continue to do it. And in their reasoning behind this decision, they said that the word security, in this case national security, should not be used irresponsibly or vaguely, meaning unclearly or unspecifically, to do away with the rights guaranteed in the First Amendment. In this case, the freedom of the press. So that's New York Times versus the United States. On page 48 of your booklet, there's a paragraph beginning, the court ruled 6-3 in New York Times versus the United States. Okay, so I want you to read that paragraph, and then I want you to answer these 4 questions for me. Number 1, what are the Pentagon Papers? Number 2, why did the government seek a prior restraint order against the New York Times and the Washington Post? The Washington Post was also involved in this lawsuit. Really good movie, by the way, called The Post, was made a couple of years ago. It's all about this story, I'm telling you. You can watch that movie and get a lot more background information. Third question, why did the court find the prior restraint request unconstitutional? And then the last question is just for you. I want you to imagine that you are the editor of the New York Times. The editor is the person who decides what is printed in the newspaper and what is not. So if you're the editor of the New York Times and you're looking at this material from the Pentagon Papers, you get to decide, do we print this or do we not print this? So you're the editor of the New York Times. Do you print it? If your answer is yes, tell me why. And if your answer is no, I wouldn't print it, tell me why in that answer also. Okay? So that's it for this particular lesson. It brings together the Vietnam War conflict in a general sense and this lawsuit about the First Amendment and also the Nixon administration. We'll learn a little bit more in the next lesson about President Nixon when we talk about law and order presidents. But that's a lesson for another time. We're done today. I will see you in the next video.